The cold night swallowed the road as Jonathan drove toward a town he had never heard of before. 34 years ago, a snowstorm stole everything from him. His wife, Evelyn, and their daughter, Emma. They vanished without a trace, leaving him drowning in unanswered questions. Now, an anonymous letter has shattered the silence of the past, leading him to a forgotten place by the sea. A place where time doesn't move as it should. A place where the past is not really the past. But when he finally arrives, the truth waiting for him is nothing like he imagined. Why does the town feel so familiar? Who is the girl who looks exactly like his daughter all those years ago? And why does everyone insist that his wife never left? This is a story of loss, deception, and a search for redemption that will leave you questioning everything. Watch closely, listen carefully, and don't forget to leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? Now let's begin. The night was thick with fog, the headlights of Jonathan Reed's car barely piercing through the dense mist that clung to the empty road. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as the letter sat open on the passenger seat beside him. His breath was uneven, his heart pounding in his chest. 34 years. 34 years since the snowstorm had taken everything from him. His wife, Evelyn, his daughter, Emma. He had searched endlessly, followed every dead lead, spoken to every possible witness, only to be met with the same answer. Nothing. They were gone, vanished into the icy wind, leaving behind only the ghost of their memory. But now this letter, a letter with no name, no return address, had changed everything. It was old, yellowed at the edges, as though it had been waiting for him for years. The message inside was brief but impossible to ignore. They are not lost. They are here. Come to Blackwood Bay. You will find the truth. His mind screamed that it was a hoax, a cruel joke, but his heart whispered something else. The address on the envelope led to a town he had never heard of, a small coastal place that, according to maps, barely existed. Blackwood Bay. The name sat heavily in his mind, unfamiliar yet strangely unsettling. He hadn't hesitated. He packed his bag, got in his car, and now, after hours of driving through deserted highways, he was finally close. His fingers twitched as he picked up the letter again, scanning the words for some hidden clue, some unspoken truth between the lines. But there was nothing except the unbearable weight of hope pressing against his ribs. The fog thickened as he approached the town. The road narrowed, winding along a steep cliffside, and below, he could hear the restless waves crashing against the rocks. The air was damp, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something old, forgotten. As he passed the town's faded welcome sign, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. The streets were empty, the houses standing in silence, their windows dark. A single gas station stood at the edge of the town, its flickering neon sign buzzing softly in the night. Jonathan pulled in, stepping out of the car with cautious steps. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a town so close to the sea. He pushed open the door to the gas station, and the bell above jingled weakly. The cashier, an older man with sunken eyes and deep lines on his face, looked up from behind the counter, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Passing through?" the man asked, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in days. Jonathan hesitated. "No, I'm looking for someone who might be here." The cashier's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned forward slightly. Blackwood Bay's a small town. Not many people come here unless they're lost. Jonathan swallowed, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "I got a letter. Someone told me my wife and daughter might be here." The man didn't blink. "That so?" Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulling out the letter, and placed it on the counter. The cashier glanced at it, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You should leave," he muttered, pushing the letter back toward him. A chill ran down Jonathan's spine. "Why?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Jonathan, out the window, as if searching for something. "There's a motel down the road," he finally said. If you're set on staying, that's your only option. Jonathan knew when a conversation was over. He picked up the letter, slipping it back into his coat pocket, and nodded. Thanks. The man didn't respond, only watching as Jonathan walked back to his car. As he pulled out of the gas station, he caught one last glimpse of the cashier in the rearview mirror, standing at the window, unmoving, eyes following him into the night. The motel was small, barely more than a dozen rooms lined up in a single row. A dim porch light flickered outside the front office. Jonathan stepped inside, greeted by the musty scent of old carpet and the distant hum of a television. Behind the desk sat a woman, perhaps in her 50s, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked up, her expression neutral, but when Jonathan gave his name, her face paled slightly. Reed, she echoed, as though the name meant something to her. Yeah, he said cautiously. Is there a problem? She shook her head quickly, forcing a smile. No problem at all. She slid a key across the desk. Room 6, last one on the end. Jonathan hesitated but took the key. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Mr. Reed, she said quietly, her fingers tapping against the counter. Sometimes people come here looking for things they shouldn't. He met her gaze, searching for some meaning behind her words. I just want answers. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then I hope you find them. The room was small but clean. A single bed, a wooden nightstand, a lamp that flickered slightly when he turned it on. He placed his bag on the chair and pulled off his jacket, exhaling deeply. The exhaustion from the long drive was starting to weigh on him, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the letter out once more, staring at it as if the words might change. Then something caught his eye. A small envelope, tucked into the nightstand drawer, yellowed with age. His breath hitched as he reached for it, fingers trembling. He opened it carefully, and inside was a single photograph. His heart stopped. It was Emma, standing on a beach, barefoot in the sand. But it wasn't just a photograph, it was recent. The colors were vibrant, the image crisp. It was impossible. His daughter had disappeared 34 years ago. The back of the photograph had a single line written in ink. Come to the shore. Midnight. A shiver crawled up his spine. He looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. His pulse pounded in his ears. Someone had left this for him. Someone wanted him to find it. The motel manager? The gas station clerk? Or someone else? He shoved the photograph into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the night. The ocean roared in the distance, the waves crashing relentlessly against the shore. The wind carried whispers, voices lost in the tide. Jonathan made his way down the narrow path leading to the beach, his breath heavy with anticipation. The sand was cold beneath his feet as he approached the water's edge. And then he saw her, a figure standing near the waves, long hair flowing in the wind, a familiar silhouette frozen in time. His voice caught in his throat. Emma. The figure turned, and for the first time in 34 years, Jonathan looked into the face of his daughter. But she hadn't aged a single day. Jonathan's breath hitched in his throat. His entire body froze, every nerve in his being screaming that what he was seeing was impossible. Yet there she was, standing at the edge of the water, her bare feet sinking slightly into the wet sand as the waves kissed the shore. His daughter, Emma. The same soft brown curls, the same wide green eyes, the same delicate features frozen exactly as they had been 34 years ago. It was as if time had never touched her, as if she had been plucked from the past and placed here, in front of him, unaged, unchanged. His legs felt like they were moving through water as he stepped forward, the cold wind biting at his face. Emma, his voice cracked, breaking under the weight of disbelief. His mind raced, grasping for some kind of explanation. Had he finally lost himself to grief? Was this a cruel trick of exhaustion and desperation? But she was real. She was right there. Emma's lips parted slightly, her gaze fixed on him as if seeing him was just as shocking to her as it was to him. For a brief second, Jonathan thought he saw something flicker in her expression. Recognition? Relief? Fear? But then, just as quickly, her face smoothed into something unreadable. She took a step back. "Who are you?" The words shattered something inside him. He stopped mid-step, his breath stolen from his lungs. "Emma," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's me, it's Dad." She didn't move, didn't blink. The ocean roared behind her, the wind howling through the empty beach, but she stood still as stone, staring at him with those familiar eyes that now held only uncertainty. "I don't know you." Jonathan felt as if the world had tilted beneath his feet. He opened his mouth, trying to form words, to make sense of what was happening, but nothing came. His mind was screaming that this wasn't possible. She was his daughter, the daughter he had spent every waking moment searching for. How could she not know him? His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the old photograph he had found in the motel. He held it up to her. "Emma, look, this is you. This was taken recently. But you..." His throat tightened. "You disappeared 34 years ago." Her eyes flicked to the photograph for only a second before returning to his face. And then, finally, she moved. But instead of coming closer, she took another step back. "You need to leave," she said softly. Jonathan shook his head, stepping forward again despite the way his legs threatened to give out beneath him. No, I need answers. Emma, where is your mother? Where have you been? How are you still?" He swallowed hard, the words feeling too surreal to say. "How are you still the same age?" Something in her expression flickered again, a crack in the carefully constructed wall she had put up between them. For a moment, it almost looked like she wanted to answer. But then, the sound of footsteps echoed across the beach. Jonathan turned sharply, his pulse spiking. A man stood further up the shore, partially hidden in the shadows of the rocks. Tall, dressed in dark clothes, his features obscured by the night. But there was something about him that sent an icy chill down Jonathan's spine. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He only watched. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "You need to go. Now." Jonathan turned back to her, desperation clawing at his chest. "Emma, wait." But she was already retreating. Her steps hurried as she moved away from him, toward the stranger. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he lunged forward. But as soon as he did, the wind howled violently, sending a spray of salt water crashing against him. He shielded his face, his body recoiling at the force of it. When he looked back, they were gone. Jonathan staggered, his heart hammering in his chest. He spun in frantic circles, searching the shoreline, the cliffs, the path leading back to town, but there was no trace of them. The only sound was the relentless crashing of waves against the rocks. The only footprints left in the sand were his own. Panic tightened around his throat. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair. Had he imagined it? No, she was here. He had seen her, spoken to her, but she hadn't known him. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat and turned back toward the motel. His thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and desperate determination. If Emma was here, if she was real, then Evelyn had to be here too. And he was going to find them. The motel room felt suffocating when he returned. The walls, the dim light, the creaking floorboards. It all pressed in around him, making it impossible to think. He sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph still clutched tightly in his hands, his mind replaying the moment over and over again. She was alive. She hadn't aged. And she didn't remember him. Jonathan exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. The town, the letter, the way the gas station clerk and the motel manager had reacted to his name. They knew something. Someone here knew the truth. And he wasn't leaving until he found it. A soft knock at the door made him jolt. His heart slammed against his ribs as he stood up, hesitating for only a moment before crossing the room. He unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see outside. The motel manager stood there, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Jonathan stared at her, his pulse still erratic. "Do you know my daughter?" The woman hesitated, shifting slightly on her feet. "Not here," she said, her voice hushed. She glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure they weren't being watched. "Meet me at the diner in an hour. I'll tell you what I can." Before he could press her for more, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. Jonathan's grip on the door tightened. His mind screamed with questions, with theories that made no sense. But one thing was clear. This town was hiding something, and he was going to uncover it no matter what. The clock on the nightstand ticked softly, each second stretching into an eternity as Jonathan sat in the dim motel room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and unanswered questions. Emma was alive. She was here in this town, but she hadn't recognized him. She hadn't aged a day, and she had told him to leave. Every fiber of his being rejected that thought. He had spent 34 years searching for answers, drowning in grief, clinging to every false hope, and now, standing on the edge of the truth, he was expected to walk away? No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. His fingers trembled as he traced the edges of the photograph he had found in the nightstand. It was real, recent, proof that she was here. But who had left it for him? And why? His mind swirled with questions, but one stood out among the rest. Who was the man on the beach? The way Emma had looked at him, it was like she trusted him, like he was someone important to her, more important than her own father. The thought sent a sharp, stinging ache through Jonathan's chest. A sudden gust of wind rattled the motel window, and he exhaled shakily, pushing himself up from the bed. The motel manager had told him to meet her at the diner in an hour. He glanced at the clock. He still had time. Time to clear his head. Time to prepare himself for whatever truth she was willing to share. Because one thing was certain, this town was hiding something, and he was going to find out what. The diner was a relic of another era, its neon sign flickering weakly above the entrance. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled food lingered in the air, mixing with the faint sound of a distant jukebox playing a song that felt older than time itself. Jonathan stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. A few people sat in booths, their faces shadowed beneath the dim lights, but no one looked up. No one acknowledged him. It was as if they all knew why he was here, and they didn't want to be involved. He spotted the motel manager sitting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. Jonathan slid into the seat across from her, his pulse hammering in his ears. "You showed up," she said quietly. "You asked me to," he replied, his voice low, controlled. "Now tell me what's going on." She exhaled slowly, glancing toward the other patrons as if making sure no one was listening. Then, leaning forward slightly, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come here, Mr. Reed." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "That's the second time I've heard that tonight. And yet, no one seems willing to tell me why." He pulled the photograph from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This is my daughter. I saw her tonight, but she hasn't aged. She doesn't remember me. So tell me, what the hell is happening in this town?" The woman's gaze flickered to the photograph, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Emma," she murmured, almost to herself. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if she wanted to reach for the picture but thought better of it. Jonathan leaned in. "You know her." It wasn't a question. A long pause stretched between them. Then finally she sighed. "I know of her." His heart pounded. "Where has she been? What happened to her and my wife?" The woman hesitated, then whispered, "Your wife was here." The air left Jonathan's lungs in a sharp exhale. He gripped the edge of the table. "Was?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know where she is now, but she was here. A long time ago." Jonathan's stomach twisted painfully. "When?" The woman hesitated. 2 years ago." His blood ran cold. "That's impossible," he rasped. "She disappeared 34 years ago." The woman looked at him then, truly looked at him, and there was something in her expression that made his skin crawl. A quiet, knowing sorrow. "Time doesn't move the same way here, Mr. Reed." she said softly. Jonathan's breath came in uneven gasps. What the hell does that mean? The woman hesitated, as if debating how much to say. Then, lowering her voice further, she whispered, "This town, it keeps things, people, moments. It doesn't let go. Your daughter, she's part of it now." Jonathan felt a deep, suffocating weight settle in his chest. "No," he said firmly. "I can take her back. I can fix this." The woman shook her head. "You don't understand. People don't just leave Blackwood Bay." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. "Then tell me how to find Evelyn. Tell me how to fix this." The woman hesitated again, then finally said, "Go to the lighthouse. It's where she was last seen." Jonathan stared at her, his pulse roaring in his ears. The lighthouse, the same one from the photograph, the same one from the background of the picture of Emma. "Be careful," the woman warned. "The past has a way of holding on to people here." Jonathan didn't respond. He pushed away from the table, his mind already made up. He was going to the lighthouse. The wind howled as he made his way up the cliffside path, the ocean roaring below. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its towering frame silhouetted against the night sky. The air was thick with salt and something else, something heavy, like the weight of memories long buried. Jonathan stepped onto the old wooden porch, his heart hammering in his chest. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dark, dust floating in the air, the scent of old wood and seawater filling his lungs. He took careful steps, his fingers brushing against the walls as he moved deeper inside. Then, in the dim light, he saw it. A small wooden table, and on it a single yellowed envelope. His breath caught as he stepped forward, his hands shaking as he picked it up. The handwriting on the front was familiar, painfully familiar. It was Evelyn's. Jonathan's pulse pounded as he tore the envelope open, his eyes scanning the faded ink. "Jonathan," it read, "if you found this, then I know you came for us. But you shouldn't have. The past isn't meant to be rewritten. You need to leave before it's too late." His hands trembled. His breath came in shallow gasps. And then, a soft voice behind him. "Jonathan." His entire body froze. He turned slowly, and there, standing in the dim light, was Evelyn. She hadn't aged a day. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The dim light from the lighthouse windows barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. His heart pounded against his ribs as he stared at the figure before him, his mind struggling to accept what his eyes were seeing. Evelyn. She stood at the far end of the room, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in soft waves, her face frozen in time exactly as he remembered. She wasn't older. There were no signs of 34 years of aging, no silver strands in her hair, no lines etched into her face by time or sorrow. She was exactly as she had been on the night she disappeared. Jonathan took a shaky step forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Evelyn." His voice came out hoarse, uncertain, as if saying her name would somehow break the fragile reality before him. She didn't move at first, her dark eyes fixed on him with an unreadable expression. Then, finally, she exhaled softly. "You shouldn't be here, Jonathan." His stomach clenched. He had been waiting over 3 decades to hear her voice again, but the words she spoke sent a sharp chill through his veins. She wasn't relieved to see him. She wasn't running to him, arms open, grateful that he had never given up on finding her. Instead, there was a quiet sadness in her tone, a warning laced within it. Jonathan's hands trembled as he clutched the letter she had written, the one he had just found. "What does this mean?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why did you write this? Where have you been? What happened to you?" Evelyn's eyes flickered toward the letter in his grasp, but she didn't move closer. She only shook her head. "Jonathan, you don't understand." "Then make me understand," he snapped, his voice raw with emotion. "I have spent 34 years searching for you and Emma. I've lost everything chasing ghosts, following leads that led to nowhere, living in a nightmare I could never wake up from. And now you're here? You're standing in front of me, telling me I shouldn't be here." He took another step closer, his throat tightening. "I need the truth, Evelyn. No more secrets. No more running. Tell me what happened." She hesitated, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. Her gaze flickered toward the windows as if she was afraid someone might be watching. "It's not that simple," she murmured. Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Then explain it to me." A silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. The lighthouse creaked softly in the wind, the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak. But then, footsteps. Jonathan turned sharply, his muscles tensing. The sound echoed from the stairwell leading to the upper level of the lighthouse, slow and deliberate. He instinctively moved in front of Evelyn, his body rigid with tension. Someone else was here. And then, emerging from the shadows, came the man from the beach. Jonathan's pulse spiked. The stranger stepped into the dim light, his face finally visible. He was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. There was something unsettlingly composed about him, something that made the hair on the back of Jonathan's neck stand on end. Evelyn inhaled sharply. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, but it wasn't directed at Jonathan. She was looking at the man. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And yet, here we are." His voice was smooth, measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Jonathan's fists clenched. "Who the hell are you?" The man studied him for a moment before answering. "My name is Victor." His gaze flickered to Evelyn briefly before returning to Jonathan. "And I imagine you have many questions." Jonathan felt his breath quicken. His entire life had been leading to this moment, to the answers that had eluded him for so long. He wanted to demand the truth, to demand that this man tell him what had happened to his family. But before he could speak, Evelyn did. "He doesn't need to know," she said quietly. Jonathan's stomach dropped. "What?" He turned to her, his hands shaking. "Evelyn, no. Don't do this. Don't shut me out. Not after everything." Victor sighed, almost as if he were tired of this conversation. "Evelyn, we both knew this day would come." He turned his gaze back to Jonathan. "The truth is complicated." Jonathan's patience snapped. "Then simplify it for me," he growled. Victor studied him for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "Your wife and daughter never left this town." Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs. "That's not possible," he choked out. "I looked. I searched everywhere." Victor shook his head. "No, you searched outside of Blackwood Bay. But this town doesn't follow the same rules as the rest of the world." Jonathan's mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" Victor exhaled, as if considering how much to reveal. "Blackwood Bay is different. It holds on to people. Time moves differently here." He glanced at Evelyn. "That's why she hasn't aged. That's why Emma hasn't aged." Jonathan's entire body went cold. His mind rebelled against the idea, against the impossibility of it all. But deep down, something in him knew that this was the truth. It was the only explanation that made sense. The letter, the photograph, the way everyone in town had reacted to his arrival, it was all connected. He took a shaky breath. "Then how do we leave?" Victor's expression darkened slightly. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Jonathan turned to Evelyn, his voice urgent. "You said I shouldn't have come, that the past isn't meant to be rewritten. Why? What happens if I try to take you and Emma out of here?" Evelyn's face was pale, her eyes shimmering with something close to fear. "Jonathan, you don't understand." "Then help me understand," he pleaded. Her fingers trembled. "Leaving comes at a price." A heavy silence settled over the room. Jonathan's chest tightened. "What price?" Victor's voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was suffocating. "Blackwood Bay doesn't just take people. It trades them." Jonathan's breath caught. He looked at Evelyn, searching for denial, for any sign that what Victor was saying wasn't true, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. His stomach twisted painfully. You're saying, if I take you and Emma out of here, someone else has to take your place? Victor nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. Jonathan's hands curled into fists. That's insane. Evelyn finally looked at him then, her eyes filled with sorrow. It's the truth. His mind spun, his thoughts colliding violently. He had spent decades searching for them, clinging to hope. And now, standing at the edge of finally bringing them home, he was faced with an impossible choice. Could he do it? Could he condemn someone else to be trapped in this place just to save his family? The weight of the decision pressed against his chest like an unbearable force. And then Victor spoke again. You'll have to decide soon, Jonathan. His voice was calm, unwavering, because Blackwood Bay never lets go of what it owns. Jonathan swallowed hard. He had come looking for the truth, and now he wished he had never found it. Jonathan's mind spiraled into chaos, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps as the weight of Victor's words pressed down on him like an unbearable force. Blackwood Bay doesn't just take people, it trades them. The sentence echoed in his head, over and over, twisting like a knife in his gut. He turned to Evelyn, searching for some kind of contradiction, for some sign that what Victor was saying was a lie. But she didn't deny it. She didn't tell him it wasn't true. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her hands trembling at her sides. Jonathan took a step back, the walls of the lighthouse suddenly feeling too close, the air too thick. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. How long have you known? Evelyn flinched at the raw pain in his tone. Jonathan, how long? He demanded, his fists clenching. She swallowed hard, her lips parting, but for a moment, no sound came out. Then, finally, she whispered, since the beginning. Jonathan felt the floor tilt beneath him. His stomach lurched, a sharp wave of nausea threatening to overtake him. Since the beginning. That meant she had known all along. All these years, all the endless nights he had spent searching, the decades he had lost drowning in grief and unanswered questions. She had known. He felt like he couldn't breathe. You let me believe you were gone, he choked out. You let me suffer. Let me search. Let me waste my entire life thinking you and Emma were dead. His voice cracked. And all this time you were just here? Evelyn's eyes shimmered with tears. It wasn't that simple. Jonathan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It wasn't that simple? He ran a shaking hand through his hair, his entire body trembling with the force of his emotions. Evelyn, do you have any idea what I've been through? What I've done to find you? He took a step closer, his voice dropping into something raw, desperate. Why didn't you try to come back? She exhaled shakily, her gaze flickering toward Victor before returning to Jonathan. Because I couldn't. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You mean you wouldn't? Evelyn's lips trembled. Jonathan, please. No, he snapped, shaking his head. You don't get to plead with me. You don't get to ask for understanding. Not when you've been alive, while I... His voice broke, and he turned away, his hands on his hips, trying to steady himself. Victor watched him with quiet patience, his expression unreadable. Now you understand, he said. This town doesn't just take people. It decides who stays. And once you're part of it, you don't leave. Not without consequences. Jonathan turned back, his hands still trembling. And what if I take them anyway? His voice was steel now, the raw agony hardening into something sharper, something determined. What if I don't accept your rules? What if I walk out of here with my family and never look back? Victor tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then someone else will take their place. Jonathan's chest tightened. And if I refuse? Victor exhaled, as if he had expected the question. Then Blackwood Bay will take its own payment. The words sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. He didn't fully understand what that meant, but he knew it wasn't good. He turned back to Evelyn. Tell me there's another way, he pleaded. She hesitated, just for a moment, and then softly, there isn't. Jonathan's heart clenched. His mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that there had to be another way. But deep down, he knew the truth. He could feel it in the bones of this town, in the way time didn't move right here, in the way the people watched him with quiet knowing in their eyes. Blackwood Bay was a trap, and his family had been caught in it for 34 years. But now he had a choice. He could walk away, leave them here and continue his life alone. Or he could take them and let someone else be taken in their place. The weight of the decision threatened to crush him. Then, a quiet voice broke through the silence. "There is another way." Jonathan turned sharply. It wasn't Victor who had spoken. It was Emma. She stood in the doorway, her dark curls tousled by the wind. Her green eyes locked onto Jonathan's with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Victor stiffened slightly. "Emma," he said, his tone carefully neutral. She ignored him. Her gaze was only on Jonathan. "You don't have to trade anyone," she said softly. Jonathan's pulse pounded. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, then took a slow step forward. "I know a way to break the town's hold." Victor's face darkened. "No, you don't." Emma lifted her chin. "Yes, I do." Jonathan's mind reeled. He turned to Victor. "What is she talking about?" Victor's jaw clenched. "She's wrong." But Jonathan wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were locked onto his daughter, the daughter he had lost, the daughter who had somehow been frozen in time, trapped in this place for decades. And yet, she was the only one offering him hope. "What do we have to do?" he asked her. Emma hesitated for only a moment. Then she whispered, "We have to go back to where it all started." Jonathan's heart pounded. "The night you disappeared." She nodded. "The storm, the snow, the moment Blackwood Bay took us." Evelyn's face was pale now, her hands clasped together tightly. "Emma, no." But Emma's gaze didn't waver. "It's the only way." Jonathan exhaled shakily, his mind spinning. He didn't know what she meant, didn't understand how any of this was possible. But he had spent too long living without answers. And he wasn't going to lose his family again. He turned to Evelyn. "We're doing this." Her lips parted slightly, her expression torn between fear and something else. Something like hope. Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." Jonathan squared his shoulders. "We'll see." The decision was made. They were going back to the night everything changed. And this time, he wasn't leaving without his family. The night air was thick with salt and something heavier. Something that pressed against Jonathan's skin like an unseen force, trying to pull him under. The lighthouse loomed behind them, its single beam cutting through the darkness in slow, methodical sweeps, illuminating the jagged cliffs and the restless ocean below. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, a ceaseless, hungry rhythm that matched the pounding of his own heart. He stood between Evelyn and Emma, his mind spinning, his body taut with tension. The weight of their presence, real, solid, unchanged after 34 years, was both a comfort and a burden. They were here, but they were not free. And now Emma was saying there was another way. Jonathan turned to his daughter, his throat tight with emotion. "You said we have to go back to the night you disappeared," he said, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "What does that mean? How do we do that?" Emma glanced at her mother before turning back to him. "Blackwood Bay isn't like other places," she said quietly. "It doesn't just take people. It holds them in moments." Jonathan frowned. "Moments?" Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Time here doesn't move the way it should." Emma nodded. "The night we disappeared, it still exists here. It's still happening. It's like a thread that was never cut. If we find it, we can follow it back." Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps. It didn't make sense. And yet, somehow, it did. The way time had seemed frozen. The way Emma and Evelyn hadn't aged. The way people in the town spoke in quiet, knowing tones. It all fit into something he couldn't explain but had to believe. He turned to Victor. "Is this true?" Victor exhaled slowly. "Even if it were, you're making a mistake." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "Why? Because I won't play by your rules? Because I refuse to let this town decide who stays and who goes?" Victor studied him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Because you don't know what you're risking." Jonathan's pulse pounded. Then tell me. Victor hesitated, then took a slow step closer. You think this town just let them exist here for 34 years? That it didn't take something from them in return? A sharp chill ran down Jonathan's spine. He turned to Evelyn. What is he talking about? Evelyn's lips parted, but before she could speak, Victor continued. They are part of Blackwood Bay now, he said. If you try to take them back, if you try to break the hold this place has on them, you might not like what happens next. Jonathan's stomach twisted. You're saying, if we go back, if we change what happened, they might not make it? Victor didn't blink. I'm saying they might not exist at all. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. His breath caught. His vision blurred for a second as the weight of the possibility crushed him. He had spent years dreaming of this moment, of finding them, of bringing them home. But what if home didn't exist for them anymore? What if breaking free from Blackwood Bay meant losing them forever? Emma reached for his hand. Dad, she whispered. He looked down at her, his daughter who was still a child, frozen in time. His daughter who should have been a grown woman by now, with a life of her own, a future that had been stolen from her. She squeezed his fingers gently. We have to try, she said. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. Victor sighed, shaking his head. You're forcing something that was never meant to be undone. Jonathan's voice was steel. Then watch me. Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Evelyn exhaled softly. We need to go to the shoreline, she said, her voice steady now. That's where it happened. That's where it started. Jonathan nodded. He turned and led the way, his feet moving with purpose even as his heart warred between hope and terror. The ocean roared louder as they descended the cliffside path, the sand damp beneath their shoes. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the water, illuminating the mist that clung to the shore like a living thing. Emma walked a few paces ahead, her gaze locked onto the horizon. I remember, she murmured. Jonathan hesitated. Remember what? She turned to him, her expression unreadable. The night we disappeared. I remember everything. A chill crawled up Jonathan's spine. Tell me. Emma took a slow breath. It was snowing. The storm came so fast. Mom and I were in the car and you were supposed to meet us. But then, she swallowed. The road just vanished. The snow turned into fog, and suddenly we weren't on the road anymore. We were here. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He remembered that night, the panic, the desperate calls that went unanswered, the way the road had been completely covered, wiped away by the blizzard. And now, hearing it from Emma's perspective, it was as if the storm itself had swallowed them whole. Evelyn's voice was soft. It wasn't just the storm. It was Blackwood Bay. It took us. Jonathan clenched his fists. Then we take you back. Emma nodded. She turned to face the ocean, her body tense. It has to be now. Jonathan followed her gaze. The water shimmered in the moonlight, dark and endless, stretching into the unknown. And then, something shifted. The air grew colder. The wind stilled. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Jonathan's pulse spiked. A mist rose from the waves, thick and swirling, creeping toward the shore with unnatural speed. It curled around them, wrapping them in a suffocating embrace. And then, Jonathan saw it. Through the mist, through the haze, the impossible took shape. A road, the same road they had lost all those years ago, stretching out before them like a memory pulled from time. The tire tracks in the snow, the distant glow of headlights, the shape of a car, barely visible, its silhouette frozen in the past. Jonathan's breath caught. It was the night they disappeared, happening all over again. He turned to Emma and Evelyn. This is it, he whispered. Emma nodded. We have to go before it fades. Jonathan grabbed Evelyn's hand, his grip tight, unwilling to let her slip away again. They stepped forward, and the past swallowed them whole. The moment Jonathan stepped into the mist, the world around him shifted. The cold air of Blackwood Bay melted away, replaced by something heavier, something thick and suffocating. The weight of time pressed against his chest as if the past itself was resisting his presence. warning him that he did not belong here. His fingers tightened around Evelyn's hand, afraid that if he let go, even for a second, she would slip away again. Beside him, Emma clutched his other hand, her small fingers trembling slightly, but her face was set with determination. She led the way, her steps unshaken, as though she had walked this path before. And maybe, in some way, she had. Jonathan didn't understand how any of this was happening, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he had a chance to undo what had been done, a chance to bring his family back. The road stretched ahead of them, appearing and disappearing in flickers, as if reality itself was uncertain. Snowflakes drifted through the air, their descent slow and dreamlike, but the cold didn't bite the way it should. Jonathan's breath didn't fog in the air, and his footsteps didn't leave prints in the snow. It was like walking through a memory, a scene frozen in time. And then he saw it, the car. It sat at the edge of the road, its headlights cutting through the mist, illuminating the falling snow. The sight of it sent a jolt through Jonathan's chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. He knew this car. He knew this moment. He had lived this night over and over again in his nightmares. Evelyn's grip on his hand tightened. "Jonathan," she whispered. His throat was dry, his pulse erratic. He wanted to move forward, to run to the car, to throw open the doors and pull them to safety, but fear rooted him in place. What if this wasn't real? What if touching it shattered the illusion? What if a shadow moved behind the windshield? Jonathan's heart stopped. Someone was inside. A lump formed in his throat as he took a shaky step forward, his legs heavy, as though the weight of the past was trying to drag him down. He could see them now, two figures in the front seats. Evelyn in the driver's seat, her face barely visible through the frosted glass. And Emma in the back, her small hands pressed against the window, her lips parted in a silent cry. Jonathan's entire body tensed. This was it. This was the moment they had been taken. He didn't remember it clearly, didn't know what had happened after this second. One moment they had been on the road. The next they were gone. But now he was here. He could stop it. He could change it. His breath hitched as he stepped closer. Evelyn, the Evelyn beside him stiffened, her eyes locked onto her own reflection in the car window. Jonathan's stomach twisted at the impossible sight. Two versions of her. One trapped in time, the other standing beside him, still untouched by age. Jonathan reached for the car door, his fingers brushing the handle. But the moment he touched it, the world shattered. The ground beneath him lurched, the sky cracked apart, and the entire scene around him rippled like a broken reflection in water. He stumbled backward, gripping Evelyn and Emma tightly as the road dissolved beneath their feet, the snow swirling violently, turning into a storm. And then, they were somewhere else. The road was gone. The car was gone. The headlights, the snow, the memory of the past. It all dissolved into darkness. Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears as his vision adjusted to the dim, flickering light around them. They were standing inside a house. Jonathan's breath came in uneven gasps. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper. The wooden floors creaked beneath their weight. A fire burned in the fireplace, casting an eerie glow over the room. The furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had lived here for years. Emma turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it began." Jonathan's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" Evelyn's gaze was fixed on the room, her lips parted in shock. "I know this place." Jonathan turned slowly, taking in the details. The bookshelves, the old piano in the corner, the framed photographs on the mantel. And then his eyes landed on one in particular, a picture of himself. His stomach dropped. He reached for the frame, his fingers brushing against the dust-covered glass. The photograph was old, the edges curled slightly. It was him, younger, standing beside Evelyn, his arm wrapped around her waist. And in her arms, Emma. Jonathan's breath hitched. His mind raced. "What is this?" he whispered. Emma exhaled softly. "This is our house." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "No," he rasped. "That's not possible." But the moment the words left his lips, the air around them shifted again. The fire flickered. The shadows in the corners of the room moved. And then, a voice. "You shouldn't have come back." Jonathan spun around, his pulse spiking. A figure stood in the doorway. Victor. But this wasn't the man from the lighthouse. This wasn't the composed, calculated Victor he had spoken to earlier. This version of him was younger. His face was unlined, his hair darker, his presence wrong. Jonathan took a step back, his entire body rigid. "What is this?" Victor tilted his head slightly, a slow, unsettling smile creeping across his lips. "This," he said, "is the truth." The room flickered again, the walls shifting like a mirage. Jonathan's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The house, the photograph, the past wasn't just a memory. It was still happening, and they were trapped inside it. Jonathan's mind spun. "Tell me what's going on," he demanded, his voice rough with desperation. Victor took a step closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim firelight. "Blackwood Bay doesn't take people, Jonathan." Jonathan's heart pounded. "Then what does it do?" Victor's smile widened. "It keeps them." The words sent a violent shiver through Jonathan's spine. His breath hitched as he turned to Evelyn, as if pleading with her to tell him it wasn't true. But her face was pale, her hands clenched at her sides, because she already knew. Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears. He had come looking for answers, and now he was part of them. Jonathan's pulse hammered in his ears as Victor's words echoed through the dimly lit house. "Blackwood Bay doesn't take people, keeps them." The weight of the statement settled deep in his bones, sending a violent shiver down his spine. This wasn't just about his family being trapped here. He was part of it now. His breath came fast and uneven as he turned to Evelyn, searching her face for any sign of denial, any sliver of reassurance that this wasn't true, that they could still leave. But the look in her eyes stole what little hope he had left. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't arguing with Victor. She wasn't telling him he was wrong, because she already knew. Jonathan took a step back, his mind racing. The house felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around him. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched across the room like unseen hands reaching for him. His own reflection in the dusty window stared back at him, unfamiliar and distorted, as if he was already fading into this place, into whatever this was. His voice was raw when he finally spoke. "I don't believe you." Victor tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You should." Jonathan clenched his fists. "If that were true, then how did I get here?" His voice grew stronger, defiant. "If this town only keeps people, then why was I able to find them? Why was I able to walk into this place?" Victor's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because Blackwood Bay doesn't just keep people, Jonathan. It calls them." The words sent a chill straight to Jonathan's core. He shook his head, his mind rebelling against the idea. "No," he whispered. "I came because of the letter, because someone sent it to me." Victor let out a slow breath. "Did they?" Jonathan's heart pounded violently. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers fumbling as he pulled out the letter, the one that had started all of this. The paper was worn, yellowed at the edges. He had read it over and over again, memorized the words, but as he unfolded it now, something changed. The ink was fading. The words, once so sharp, so clear, were blurring, dissolving like smoke. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The message that had led him here, the words that had haunted him for weeks, they were disappearing. His grip tightened on the paper, his hands shaking. "No," he rasped. "No, this was real. This brought me here." He turned to Evelyn, to Emma, pleading. "You saw it. It was real." Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Was it?" Jonathan's stomach twisted violently. His pulse pounded in his temples as he looked back at the paper, willing the words to reappear, to stay. But the more he stared, the more they faded, until all that remained was a blank page, smooth and untouched, as if nothing had ever been written on it at all. His body went cold. Victor stepped forward, his voice calm, patient. Blackwood Bay doesn't let people go, but sometimes it brings them back. Jonathan's mind reeled. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between reality and something far more terrifying. He had been so sure that he had come here searching for answers. But now he wasn't sure if he had ever had a choice. The fire crackled behind them, the shadows shifting along the walls. Emma stood close to him, her small fingers gripping his coat sleeve, her eyes locked onto his face. She wasn't confused. She wasn't afraid. She knew. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice unsteady. "You're saying, I was always meant to come here?" Victor nodded slowly. "You were never searching for them, Jonathan." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They were waiting for you." Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. His knees almost buckled, but he forced himself to stay upright, to keep fighting against this. "No," he whispered. His mind fought against the truth, against the implication of it. "No, I searched for them. I spent years. And yet," Victor interrupted smoothly, "you never found a single trace of them. Not a body, not a footprint, not even a rumor." His gaze darkened. "Until now." Jonathan shook his head violently. His voice caught, because it was true. He had searched for decades, had followed every lead, had spent his entire life chasing ghosts. And not once had he found a single clue. It had been as if Evelyn and Emma had simply vanished. Because they had never been gone. His hands trembled as he turned to Evelyn. "Tell me it's not true," he begged. Her face was pale, her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Jonathan's stomach twisted. "Evelyn, please." Her hands clenched at her sides. "I tried to send you away," she whispered. "I tried to stop you from coming." Jonathan's entire body stiffened. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling shakily. When she opened them again, they were filled with something deep, something sorrowful. "I was afraid," she admitted, "because if you came here, it meant you belonged to it, too." Jonathan felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked between her, Emma, and Victor. Everything he had believed, everything he had suffered for, had been a lie. He hadn't been searching for them. He had been returning to them. A deep, sickening silence filled the room. The fire crackled, the shadows whispered, and Jonathan felt the truth settle inside of him like ice. He wasn't here to save them. He was here because he had never truly left. A violent shudder ran through his body. His knees hit the floor as the weight of it all crashed down on him. As the past he had spent so many years running from finally caught up with him. Emma knelt beside him, her small hand resting on his. "Dad," she whispered. Jonathan looked at her, his vision blurring. "What happens now?" Emma hesitated, then looked at Victor. Victor exhaled, his expression unreadable. "That depends." Jonathan's breath hitched. "On what?" Victor met his gaze. "On whether or not you're willing to remember." The words sent a sharp jolt through Jonathan's chest, because for the first time he realized there were pieces missing, pieces of himself that he had never questioned, memories that had always felt distant, a past that had never fully made sense. And now, standing in the house that shouldn't exist, staring at the family that had never aged, he knew he had forgotten something important, something that would change everything. And as he looked back at Evelyn, at the way her lips trembled, at the way her eyes were filled with unshed tears, he knew the truth was coming, and he might not survive it. The weight of silence pressed against Jonathan's chest, suffocating and unbearable. The flickering fire cast restless shadows along the walls, distorting the room, stretching reality into something fragile and unstable. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of something vast and unknowable, his mind spiraling with questions that had no answers, only a gnawing, hollow sense of dread. Victor's words still echoed in his skull, unraveling everything he had ever believed. "You weren't searching for them. You were returning to them." Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps, his body rigid with tension. No, that wasn't possible. He had spent decades searching for his wife and daughter, had devoted his entire life to uncovering the truth. He had suffered, grieved, fought. He had lived in the shadow of their absence, drowning in the pain of their loss. How could he have been part of it all along? How could he have forgotten? His gaze flickered to Evelyn, desperate for her to deny it, to tell him that Victor was wrong. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at him with something deeply sorrowful, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak. But she didn't. She couldn't, because the truth had already been spoken. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "Tell me what I don't remember." The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Then, finally, Evelyn whispered, "Jonathan, you were here before." His stomach plummeted. His pulse pounded violently in his ears as he took an unsteady step backward, his mind rebelling against the words. "No," he rasped. "No, that's not true." Evelyn's gaze softened, but there was something in her eyes, something haunted. "It is." Jonathan's breath hitched. His hands trembled at his sides. His entire body screamed against the idea, against the implication. I don't understand." Victor exhaled, his voice eerily calm. "You were never supposed to leave, Jonathan." Jonathan's vision blurred. His head pounded. He felt like the walls of the house were closing in, pressing against him, forcing him to confront something buried deep inside his own mind. A memory, or rather, the absence of one. His life before Evelyn and Emma had disappeared, it had always felt incomplete, like fragments of a dream that slipped away upon waking. He had always assumed it was because the grief had consumed him, because the pain had made it impossible to remember anything else. But now he wasn't so sure. He clenched his fists, trying to force the memories to come, to dig past the haze in his mind. But it was like trying to grasp smoke. The more he reached, the more it slipped away. Jonathan looked at Evelyn, his voice raw. "Then why did I leave?" Evelyn's expression shattered. She shook her head, her lips trembling. "You don't want to remember." Jonathan's entire body went cold. His breath hitched. "Tell me." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Jonathan, please. Tell me." The room shuddered. A sudden gust of wind ripped through the house, extinguishing the fire, plunging them into darkness. The walls groaned, the shadows convulsing like something alive. The air turned frigid, suffocating, as if the house itself was resisting the truth. And then, the memory hit him. Jonathan staggered back, a violent shudder running through him as the images slammed into his mind like a wrecking ball, tearing down the walls that had kept them hidden for so long. His knees buckled, and he barely registered Emma's hands gripping his arms, steadying him. And suddenly he was there, not in the house, not in the present, but in the past. The night of the storm, the night everything changed. Jonathan stood on the side of the road, the snow falling thick and relentless, coating the ground in an endless white abyss. The wind howled, bitter and cruel, slicing through his coat as he stood frozen, watching the car in front of him. Evelyn's car. It was exactly as he had seen it earlier, the headlights glowing weakly through the storm, the faint outline of his wife and daughter inside. But now he remembered. He remembered why he had been standing there. He remembered what he had done. His stomach twisted violently, a sharp wave of nausea overtaking him as his past unfolded before his eyes. He had been driving behind them that night. He was supposed to meet them at the cabin. But the storm had worsened, the visibility had become near impossible, and he had taken a wrong turn. He had ended up on the cliffs above Blackwood Bay. And then the road disappeared. The snow had turned to fog, thick and suffocating, and the world had shifted. He hadn't understood it at the time, hadn't known that he had already crossed over. But he had already been taken. And when he had looked down at the bay below, he had seen the car. He had seen it sinking beneath the waves. Jonathan sucked in a sharp breath, his chest tight, unbearable. His head pounded, his hands trembling violently. No, that couldn't be right. Evelyn and Emma had disappeared in the storm. They had been taken by Blackwood Bay. They hadn't drowned. But the memory didn't lie. The car had gone off the road. It had plunged into the icy water. He had stood there, frozen in horror, screaming their names, unable to do anything as the storm swallowed them whole. And then he had forgotten. The next thing he remembered was waking up in his car, miles away, the storm gone, his mind blank. He had convinced himself that they had vanished in the snow, that something unnatural had taken them. But the truth was worse. They had died, and Blackwood Bay had kept them. Jonathan gasped, his vision darkening at the edges. His pulse roared in his ears as he was ripped back to the present, his body collapsing onto the wooden floor of the house. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his entire body shaking violently. Evelyn and Emma knelt beside him, their hands gripping his arms, their faces pale, stricken. Jonathan looked at them, his wife, his daughter, the people he had spent his entire life searching for, the people he had already lost. And now he knew. He had never been meant to find them, because they were never alive to be found. His entire body went cold. His breath hitched, his vision blurred. And then, everything went dark. Darkness swallowed him whole. Jonathan's breath was ragged, his body weightless as he drifted through an abyss that stretched infinitely in every direction. He couldn't see. He couldn't move. He felt as if he had been untethered from existence itself, floating between time and memory, lost in the void of something he could no longer deny. His family was dead. Blackwood Bay had not stolen Evelyn and Emma. It had not taken them, had not kept them in some unnatural, frozen state for the last 34 years. They had drowned. The car had gone off the road. The storm had blinded them. The wheels had slid, and the icy waters had swallowed them whole. He had watched it happen. He had seen the headlights vanish beneath the surface. He had screamed their names into the howling wind, his voice breaking, his hands clawing at the edge of the cliff. And then he had forgotten. The weight of the truth crushed him, pressing against his chest like a vice. He had built his life around a lie, had spent decades chasing ghosts, refusing to move forward, refusing to accept what had happened. He had convinced himself that something supernatural had taken them, because believing that was easier than believing he had lost them forever. But now there was no escaping it. The past had come for him. The truth had unraveled before his eyes. And now he was sinking. A distant voice broke through the void. "Dad!" Jonathan gasped as he felt a sudden weight against his chest, his body jolting violently. The darkness trembled, cracked, and light rushed in like an unstoppable tide. And then, he was back. His body collapsed onto cold, wet sand. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, his fingers digging into the shoreline, the tide lapping hungrily at his legs. He coughed violently, struggling to orient himself, his vision spinning, his head pounding. And then he saw them, Evelyn, Emma. They were standing just beyond the reach of the waves, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight. Their eyes were wide, filled with something indescribable. Jonathan pushed himself upright, his body trembling. His clothes were soaked, his breath uneven, his entire being fractured by the weight of what he had remembered. He looked at them, really looked at them. They were the same. They hadn't aged. Their faces were unchanged, untouched by time. They were still the people he had lost that night, still frozen in the moment they had died. And now he understood. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not real." Evelyn flinched. Emma's lips trembled. Jonathan's throat tightened. He felt something inside him shatter, something that had been holding him together all these years. "You're not alive," he said, the words raw, painful. "None of this is real." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Dad!" Jonathan's breath hitched. His heart ached at the sound of her voice, at the impossible sight of her standing before him. But he knew now. She wasn't supposed to be here. None of them were. Evelyn stepped forward, her expression breaking into something that looked almost like grief. "We tried to keep it from you," she whispered. We tried to let you believe that we were still here, because we knew." Her voice faltered. "We knew you wouldn't let go." Jonathan's body went rigid. He shook his head. "No," he rasped. "I spent my life looking for you. I fought for you. His voice broke. "I should have saved you." Evelyn's lips parted in sorrow. "You did." Jonathan's breath caught. His pulse roared in his ears. "What?" Emma stepped forward, her small hand reaching for his. But when she touched him, she wasn't warm. She was cold. Jonathan's chest tightened painfully. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "You were with us, Dad." Jonathan's blood ran ice-cold. The ocean crashed violently behind him, the wind howling in his ears, the air thick with something unforgiving. He turned to Evelyn, his entire body shaking. "What does she mean?" Evelyn's voice was soft, too soft. "You never left, Jonathan." His entire world lurched. He took a step back, his hands trembling, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mind fought against the words, against what they meant, against what he already knew but had refused to acknowledge. The memories, the gaps, the way time had never moved quite right, the way he had searched for decades, but had never aged the way he should have, the way no one had ever found a trace of Evelyn and Emma, or of him, because they had all died together. That night, when the storm had taken the road, when the car had gone off the cliff, he had gone with them. Jonathan stumbled, his breath catching painfully in his throat. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not." Evelyn reached for him. "Jonathan." He flinched. His hands trembled violently as he pressed them to his chest, feeling for the steady beat of his heart, for the warmth of his skin, for any proof that he was alive. But the truth had already settled in his bones. He was as much a part of Blackwood Bay as they were. He had always been. A sharp sob tore through his throat. His knees hit the sand, his hands digging into the earth, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like an ocean tide. All this time, he had been looking for himself. Emma knelt beside him, her small arms wrapping around him, her cheek pressing against his shoulder. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered. Jonathan sucked in a sharp, broken breath. "I didn't want it to be like this." Evelyn knelt beside him too, her fingers brushing his hair, her lips trembling. "Neither did we." The waves crashed against the shore. The wind howled. And then, the town began to fade. The cliffs, the lighthouse, the empty streets. They blurred, unraveled, dissolved into the mist. Blackwood Bay was letting go. Jonathan turned to Evelyn, his breath uneven. "What happens now?" Evelyn's gaze softened. "We go home." A sharp wave of emotion crashed over him. Home. For the first time in 34 years, he wasn't afraid. He closed his eyes, exhaling softly, feeling the weight lift, feeling the tide pull him in. And as the mist swallowed them whole, Jonathan let go.